Good afternoon, everybody. This is Joseph Donnelly from Jersey Free Public Library. I'm the Adult Services Librarian and team leader of the accessibility team. Today, our author chat is with I.W. Gregorio, and she's going to talk about This Is My Brain in Love. And I.W. Gregorio is a practicing surgeon by day. I love this. Mask avenging young adults writer by night. A founding member of We Need Diverse Books. She's also author of the Lamba Literary Awards finalist, None of Above. She lives in Pennsylvania with her husband and two surgeons. Thank you for coming today.
Nope. Thank you so much for having me. I was really excited to get your message because librarians are my heroes.
Thank you.
And so I'm so aware of the role that books and librarians have played in my life growing up. I'll sort of talk a little bit about my upbringing and why I decided to write my books and how amazing it is to be recognized and be able to connect to people through libraries because they are the repositories of so much knowledge and so much opportunity for love and empathy. So yes, I'm here to talk about myself and my two books, particularly This Is My Brain in Love. So these are my two books. None of the, and my presentation is showing up, right?
Yes, it is.
So these are my two books, None of the Above, and This Is My Brain in Love. And they're actually somewhat different books. They're both YA contemporary books. People often look at them and ask me, so what's the theme here? Like, I don't know if you guys know, but often authors are asked to describe or have a brand, like, so some people write fantasy novels, some people write vampire novels or horror. But I kind of feel like my brand is that I like to tell stories that spark conversations and that hopefully change lives. So as Joseph said, I am a practicing surgeon by day, and officially I'm a urologist, so you can insert your joke here. But for those people who don't know, like kids in the class, that just means that I'm a surgeon that operates on kidneys, bladder, and reproductive systems. And I get a lot of stories from my experience as a doctor. But people do always ask me, so how did a urologist become a writer? And in some ways, it's kind of the other way around. And so the answer, like a lot of things in life, has to do with my background. The answer is kind of twofold, like my journey to be an author. First of all, it's important for people to read my books, I think, to sometimes realize where I come from. And I come from a town, Utica, New York, which is a town sort of in the middle of New York, middle of upstate New York, like central New York. Like, you know how there's people describe Pennsylvania as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Pennsylvania in between, and I lived in New York, Tucky. And so I was pretty much the only person of color in my grade for many, many years. And for a long time, I felt like an outsider. And so I found my peeps, I found my friends in books, books that librarians handed me, people like Ramona Quimby or Meg Murray. The other thing that books really showed me were people and ideas that existed outside of my community. Like I said, it was really sort of New York, Tucky, and people there were very conservative and isolated. And for instance, I'd like to say that the first gay person I ever met was a person in the book. The first Black person I ever met and empathized with, the first Jewish person whose story I really inhabited was a person in a book. But I grew up, like I said, somewhat isolated. If you look at this classroom picture, I'm the only person of color. There's a kid in the front row who kind of looks like he may be Latino, but he was actually just Italian. So I always hoped from a young age to be able to communicate to people the same way that those books communicated to me. I have been writing all my life. I studied creative writing in college and actually went to graduate school before I went to medical school. And I started writing for teens and young adults for many reasons, but mostly because the books I read as a teen were the ones that really introduced me to worlds outside my small town that formed my moral code. My first book, None of the Above, was directly inspired by my medical career, by a patient that I met during residency who found out when she was 17 that she was born intersex, neither male nor female, but something in between. And None of the Above was pitched as Middlesex Meets Mean Girls. And it's about the story of a 17-year-old girl who finds out right after being elected homecoming queen that she was born intersex, and what happens when her best friend meets her secret. So None of the Above was received very well. It, sold more than 20,000 copies, and it, was a Lambda Literary finalist. And for a long time, I'll be honest, I really struggled to come up with an idea to write next. The response was amazing, I think, because the book allowed people to actually engage with the idea of that bodies can be intersex in a way that other books hadn't necessarily. And Scott Westerfeld likes to say that books are machines to inhabit the lives of other people. And I take that as a goal in everything that I write. And so for a long time, I was like, what is the next story? And it was hard because I was still, working full-time as a doctor. I literally sold my first book the day before I went into labor with my second child. So people, when they ask me how do you write a book while you're still working and have a child? And I'm like, I actually don't know, because because I couldn't, when I had the second child, it was like I had 15 children. It was just such a huge difference in my life and in my ability to focus. And so for a long time, I really struggled because I needed to find, I don't joke about it, I needed to find a subject that I was willing to neglect my children to write. So it was also important for me to tell a story that was worth telling, and that I needed to reflect on the story that I should be the one to tell. So I don't know how many of the people watching this know about the Own Voices movement, but it's this idea that certain stories certain stories about marginalized people really need to be written by people from within that community. And in that respect, I kind of regret None of the Above in many ways. And so I always tell people, if you liked None of the Above, you should definitely read the upcoming Just Ash by Sol Santana, which is an Own Voices intersex story written by an actual intersex person. So what was my own story then? What was the story that only I could write about? And it took me a long time to sort of realize that by looking back, I could think about the books that I needed as a kid. As I said, I grew up really isolated. I grew up sort of always feeling like the other and never really wondering where I stood in the world. And I also grew up with, immigrants who had a very focused view on what you had to do as a person in life, very goal-oriented, and really without a lot of wiggle room for mental illness. And that's where I came up with my idea that I wanted to write a happy story about mental illness. I especially wanted to write a story without an active attempt at suicide, because I'm sure that obviously you guys all know that mental illness is a huge subject, but for so much of the media, movies, TV shows like 13 Reasons Why, they really focus on that final act of death by suicide, which is obviously a really dramatic, huge event. But by focusing on that and by sometimes fetishizing that, I think that there's a huge opportunity that's missed in talking about everything that leads up to that, including just giving kids the tools, the language to talk about mental illness, and to talk to them about how difficult it is sometimes to access treatment, whether that be therapy or medication. There are so many barriers, and a lot of them are internal because of stigma and because of that taboo surrounding talking about it. And so again, I can't emphasize enough that focusing on crisis is a missed opportunity. I don't think that anyone needs to really belabor too long the idea that mental illness is an issue right now, particularly because of the pandemic, because of what it's done to fracture our social networks and to stress our teens out by having to do so many Zooms. I start getting heart palpitations when I do Zoom these days. And so the effects of the pandemic, especially on teen mental health, are enormous, right? With a huge increase in anxiety, depression, sleep issues, with kids are withdrawing, kids are showing aggressive behavior. It's well documented. And this is even more so an issue for Asian American communities, which are much less likely to access mental health services due to a combination of stigma, cultural taboo, lack of awareness, and sometimes language barriers as well. And I can say this from my own personal experience, that for such a long time, I felt like I didn't even know what I was feeling. And that I would see my grandmother, sometimes not be able to get out of bed and walk around listless, but not have the understanding to be able to say, actually, you are depressed. And this is something that's true of Asian American communities. It's true of a lot of other immigrant communities, Black communities. It's true for professions. And I come at this from the perspective of someone who is a doctor, that it took me years to give myself the grace to allow myself to admit that I'm taking medications and that I need them. I like to tell the story a lot about how I've been on and off of antidepressants 4 times during my life, and I'll take them and then I'll feel better, and then they'll say, oh, I don't need them anymore. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, oh, I'm strong enough to get off of them. I'm not weak like that. I don't need to be on them. And this is coming from a physician who, as someone who has gone through surgical residency. The biggest compliment you can give a surgical resident is to say that they are strong, that they've done strong work. And one of the great weaknesses is to cry in front of patients, which I have done multiple times. So like I said, for many years, I was on medications when I needed them, when I was in crisis, and then I stopped them. And it wasn't until my 4th year of residency that I finally had a therapist who I talked to, and at that point I wasn't on medications, and she was just like, Eileen, your brain needs serotonin. Why are you denying? You need medications. And it was like a light bulb moment where I realized that I would never deny a diabetic patient insulin because somehow their body was weak and they couldn't manage their sugar. Why would I deny myself medication? And I often feel that the way that we even the word mental illness is kind of problematic, right? Because it assumes it's all in someone's head. It's just a psychological issue, but psychological issues manifest themselves in physical ways. Anxiety manifests itself in elevated heart rate, palpitations, shaking, and depression manifests itself in physical symptoms of like just the inability to even move sometimes. And just even changing the way that we talk about it that way is helpful. And particularly in Asian communities, I think that because so many of that generation are focused on, success and survival, anxiety and depression are considered American illnesses. Because it is kind of true, if your focus is on survival, you don't have, I guess some people would say, you don't have time to think about those things. But people certainly haven't been given the space to talk about that as well. Yeah, for such a long time, I felt that my depression was a sign of weakness. And as I've grown and become a parent, I really think that that weakness is actually my strength. As a doctor, I feel that my ability to sit down with the patient and really empathize with their suffering, it's really important. And it's really important for me to, as it were, come out with mental illness. So I kind of consciously did that when I wrote this book, when I wrote This Is My Brain in Love. I actually had a patient read a feature that was done on me in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he emailed me, and I've been treating him for years, doing invasive procedures on him, like seeing parts of his anatomy that no one else has seen, but we didn't know each other. And he sent me an email and was like, Dr. Wong, I didn't know you were one of us. I didn't know that you also suffered from this. And it was wonderful because it was a connection that I feel like I hadn't made. And it is also poignant for me to realize how good people are at fronting and how good they are at hiding these aspects of themselves. And that's something that I've been trying actively to do to model what it means to be outwardly accepting of my mental illness, just to talk with my daughter about seeing a therapist, about what my therapist said, to talk to her about how my medications have made me feel so much better in many ways. And medication is a hard thing, and that's something that I discuss in the book. I don't want to give a spoiler alert. I don't want to spoil anything, but in the very first pages of the book, a character, an unnamed character, is looking at a bottle of pills and wondering what to do with them. And it circles around to the end, and I don't want to spoil anything, but I can talk a little bit more about the structure of the book, and again, why I felt so strongly about writing it. So obviously the first thing I wanted to do was write a happy book about mental illness. And so it was really important for me to have different points of view. And so one of the creative decisions I made when I was writing This Is My Brain in Love was to have it be dual narrative, to have it be a rom-com, but from the dual point of view of a girl who's suffering from depression and a boy who's suffering from anxiety. And for me, that was incredibly important because it was a way for me to show how two people with different mental illnesses can look at the same exact incident and come off with incredibly different reactions. And the points of view color their cognitive distortions, like, affect the way that they process the entire event. And that was really important for me. Another thing that I wanted to do in the story was that I did want to subvert Asian stereotypes. It's kind of, I think that to back up a little bit into my very first novel and the group that I helped found called We Need Diverse Books, representation is really important to me. And part of this is because I grew up as a person where I loved to read, but there were maybe 2 Asian American girls in the books that I read that were positive. The other depictions of Asian people were things like The Five Chinese Brothers, where you have 5 people with yellow faces that all look the same with the Q ponytail, or Tiki Tiki Tembo, where the main character's name was made fun of the entire book. The first book where I even marginally saw who I was growing up was The Year of the Born Jackie Robinson by Betty Ballord. But even then, that book spoke to me in many ways, but it didn't in others, because she was a first-generation immigrant living in New York City, in Chinatown. I was a second-generation immigrant living in a much less diverse part of upstate New York. So that just goes to show, I think, how much diversity there is within a diversity. And I'm so happy that nowadays, if you look at the books here, all the books here are written by Asian American authors. And there are books by Chinese authors, Japanese authors, Korean authors, mixed race Asian authors, Thai authors, authors who are Asian and gay, authors who are Asian and have mental illness. So the diversity within diversity is something that is very new to the children's literature world, and something that I'm really happy to actually have played a role in. When I first started writing, gosh, it's scary, it's almost a decade ago. It's more than a decade ago. It was residency, it was after that therapist. Interestingly enough, that therapist asked me what I would do if I weren't a doctor, and I said I would be a writer. And so as good as she was in telling me that I need medication, she also responded to my saying I want to be a writer by saying, "Oh, that's a good thing you're a writer. You just don't have the personality to be a writer." I was so mad. I wrote a book in response, and I'm grateful for that. There are other reasons why I wrote the book too, because I had actually from my high school, Grace Lynn, the Newbery honor-winning author, went to my high school, and so she gave me. She's such a groundbreaking author for me to realize that someone I knew could achieve those dreams that I had as a child. And so I wrote my first book, and I got an agent. I had multiple agent offers, But when we sent it out on submission, 3 separate editors from the big 5, now it's not even big 5 anymore, but it was the big 5 publishers, 3 separate editors said, oh, we love this book, we love Eileen's voice, but it's too similar to another Asian American book on our list. As if they could only have one, as if there was a quota, as if one book could speak for all Asian Americans. And yes, it's true that a lot of books by minorities have certain themes, but they're very different ways of processing the themes. And that's something that I think, I know that the publishing world has come to terms with and is embracing now. And part of that's because of We Need Diverse Books, which is a grassroots organization that started in 2014 in response to the horrible statistics showing how few books that are published that are really pushed and acclaimed were written by people of color. And this is important for us as a nation, because 50% of kids these days are going to be kids of color. And it's important that these libraries that Joseph curates reflect all Americans and all their stories. So that was a really, really long way of me getting to the point that representation is important to me. And so when I was writing the story, I'll tell you the story of the actual thing that inspired the backbone of the story, not the parts about mental illness, but the backbone of the story, which is the idea that it was a story about a girl trying to save her family's failed restaurant. And the initial pearl of an idea, actually the grain of sand that the pearl formed around, has to do with a Chinese restaurant that used to exist in my current town. And it was, this hole in the wall. It was a typical takeout Chinese restaurant that was really not the nicest place for you to eat in at. It was run by a family. Not everyone spoke the best English. And so I remember going in one day and seeing a tall white guy, like completely acne filled, trying to roll sushi very awkwardly. And I remember thinking, there's got to be a story behind that. He must have a crush on the daughter or something like that. And so that's where the idea came out that it could be a rom-com based in a work setting in a restaurant, because I love food. Food is in many ways the ways in which I most embrace my culture and my background. And it's an important aspect of the book. But as I was plotting the book out, thinking about who I want these characters to be. Initially the boy interest was going to be Italian American, like my husband. But then I realized, let's push it a little farther than that. Let's push it. What if he were a Black boy? Because one of the things that's really unspoken and that isn't explored much in literature is the tension within minority groups, and the tension that exists between, what real or not, or manufactured, between the Asian American community and the Black community. Part of this is because Asian Americans have intentionally, by some, been put forward as a model minority, as if to contrast other minorities with. And a lot of why I wanted to write this book was to push against this idea of the model minority. So my Asian character is the one that is less well off and not as great of a student, and more rebellious, where the Black kid is the one who comes from a more affluent family, as a straight A student. I wanted to write a lot. I wanted to essentially address a lot of tropes that you find about Asian women, the submissive Asian female, or the wise, Asian elder, or the cheap Asian parent, which unfortunately I have sort of become, so I can't really deny that, but I can accept that trope and realize that there's no judgment attached to it. Things like the Dragon Lady, all these myths and stereotypes that I think people buy into when they see who I am or when they see my name in print. And that was an important element of the story as well. And so there's the mental illness aspect, there's the the intentional inverting of certain tropes. And then the third element was the plot line, which has to do with saving a restaurant and the fact that sometimes embracing a lot of those tropes are what you need to do to save yourself. And I'm pretty proud of the book. I hope you guys all read it. I know that we're nearing the time when we can talk, we can stop to talk about talk and have some Q&A. And I'm happy to just accept any questions from the viewers as well, because I feel like I've been going on for some time. So I'm going to take a glass of water.
Okay. That was, yeah, I will, after listening to you about This Is My Brain and Love, I will continue reading this book and finish it, and it's probably, and enjoy it as much as you wrote it. Question about mental health and medications. I was reading about a book. A woman was on lithium, which is a great medication, but it tends to affect your health at some point, like your kidney function, or if you wanted to have a child or something like that. A lot of medications do affect you in some way with your health. That is correct.
Absolutely. And that's something that I definitely discuss in the book as one of the reasons why people don't want to take medications. And that's one of the harder things about, I think, treating teens is that, you know, one could argue that they're less able to give informed consent than adults because they might not know, but what they do know is their own pain. And I think that most of these side effects, if not all, they are reversible. And certainly there are the more toxic drugs like lithium that are sort of last resort medications, because the other medications are used first line. But sometimes what's interesting is that sometimes the hesitancy can be from the parent and not the child, because either because the parent's not the one who's actually experiencing the pain, but also because, like I said, they might just know more and have more contacts. And as a doctor, as a surgeon, I'm really, really aware of the of how thorny informed consent can be, and that I have to give people my experience and the evidence that I have, but that I also have to step back and allow people to make their own decision. But the important thing is to balance, you know, the stories of people who are helped by it with the ones who aren't. It's a very, very personal decision. And it's something that I remember I had to deal with when I was pregnant with my second child and needed to figure out whether to continue with the medications or not. And in the end, OBGYNs do recommend that you stay on them, just because it's so important to the health of the child that their mom be engaged and able to interact with them. And obviously postpartum depression is a real thing.
I have a question. I wanted to first thank you for sharing your story, and for, you know, writing a positive book on mental health as a social worker, but also somebody who is diagnosed with anxiety and depression. I wanted to know what you recommend, how you recommend these children teens, young adults, how they go about talking to their parents when they do feel like something is wrong. Because I feel like that's part of the issue, is that a lot of people don't feel that they can go to their parents because of the stigma or this generational thoughts, especially children of color. So I wanted to know what you recommend or your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I feel that we live in a really fortunate time in that things are getting better, and that more and more, for instance, more and more celebrities are coming out to talk about their mental illness. And that's a really great easy way. For instance, or even better basketball players who are coming out. And so maybe, a kid is watching a basketball game with their dad and like, hey, did you hear that so-and-so said this about, and I remember Michael Phelps actually worked in a documentary to talk about called The Weight of Gold that talks about the toll of Olympic athletes on mental illness. So the great thing is that we live in a time right now where there are lots and lots of access points to these discussions because people are starting to come out. Because you can be watching the Olympics and you can talk about it. You can be watching basketball and you can talk about it. You can be watching movies and talk about actors and actresses who've either died by suicide or who have, talked about openly about, like Kanye West, for instance. These things are out there now in a way that they, I think, never were before. And the important thing too is to also realize the non-celebrities who might be suffering from these things. So that's why it was so important for me to come out to my patients and to my family, because it's so much more common than people think. Probably half the people in this country have some form of mental illness, and that includes ADHD, and that includes all these other neuroatypical things that affect their daily living. I really think that crazy is the new normal.
I have a twofold question. One, my younger brother, when he was younger, he suffered from anxiety stress disorder. When it got too much for him, he would pass out. He'd be out for hours. And we have medical professionals in our family, and like, okay, you got to take him to, we took him everywhere to find out what was causing him to pass out and why he was doing it. And when doctors said, we finally figured out what's wrong, because he suffered from anxiety stress disorder. When it gets too much for him, his body shuts down. And so he can hide away from all the anxiety and the stress. So from on vacation, he went to see a psychiatrist, talk about his issues, and he's a lot better today than he was several years ago. Because it started in grammar school and got worse when he was in high school. They went everywhere. We went to White Plains, we went to Columbia University Hospital, we went here and there until they finally figure out what was wrong. And I'm not ashamed to admit this, because we need to know, people need to know what's going on in this world. I mean, if you have anxiety stress disorder, from bipolarism or schizophrenia, because I think it's gotten worse since during the pandemic, because not everybody be able to go see a doctor or see a psychiatrist or psychologist or get the proper medications they needed, correct?
Yeah, the pandemic has been really hard in that a lot of people communicate best when they're face to face. Obviously, there are nonverbal cues that you can make, and just the act of being close to another person changes the way that you interact with them. At the same time, in some ways, it is increased access, because some people love telehealth. So for some people where transportation is a huge issue, and where just being able to get to their car, get to their car and get there, it was a barrier. And so, I mean, the problem is that the problem is so magnified now that therapists are overloaded, they're stressed out, it's harder to get appointments. And that speaks to the fact that we should keep on encouraging people to go into mental health care, and that we should, as a country, potentially work together to get that care paid for, because mental health coverage is an enormous issue for many, if not most Americans, even people with insurance. The copays that sometimes you have to pay can be prohibitive. And, I think that everyone is more aware of these things, but it's still tough, because there are only so many resources, which is why it's incumbent upon, I think, parents and teachers to educate themselves on strategies and on, but it is hard because often you can identify someone, but can't necessarily get them to see a therapist right away. That's why I'm so overjoyed to hear that, yeah, your library has a social worker. I mean, that's incredible. That's a really amazing step because it, you know, library is an access point for a lot of people.
Yes. It is. And my second question is, now as you look at me, everybody assumes I have a full. Everybody assumes that my family is total white, which is not true. Because I have Filipino, I have Asians, Filipinos, Dominicans, Tex-Mex. I was at a program for my uncle. He was retiring from the board, Jersey's board of trustees meeting, and he introduced everybody that got up. And then afterwards, and the next day, a coworker came up. It's like, I'm really impressed about your family. I says, what do you mean? Well, they're not all white. And it's like, I looked at it as an offense, and it's like, everybody, I said to her, and I was taken back about it. It's like, you assumed wrong. It's like, not everybody is. I was like, we have a multicultural family. We have a very ethnic background. What you just saw is what you see. Like, yeah, so I was a little taken back by it, and I was a little angry about it, but it's like, I always introduce my two nephews, my niece and my two nephews are Dominican, and they speak fluent Spanish to me. I look at them and it's like, what are you guys trying to say to me? And but yeah, I love it. It's like, I love Spanish, and I try to fire back at them, and it's like, and they shake their head. It's like, no, you're wrong. So I love it. So
it's really important these days to not make assumptions because
yes,
there's so many mixed race families. It's interesting too that part of that plays out for kids of mixed race. I actually am writing a short story for an anthology called Bridges and Islands, which is a book with stories about kids who grew up in mixed race families. Because for so many people, so many mixed race kids, it's a struggle to really figure out how they identify and how they are identified by others, because there are a lot of Latinas that are, white passing. There are, some African Americans can pass as well, and not even going into transracial adoption and interracial marriages. I mean, I would hope that as a nation right now, we're all trying to not make assumptions about each other.
yes. Are you planning on anything new in a new books that you're going to be writing about? Anything that's
I mean, I have
what's going on?
So I have 4 more years, right? Because it took me 5 years to write this one. So, but it takes a long time because I have a limited amount of time after work.
Writing is hard, right?
Yeah, I mean, I literally wrote this book between the hours of 9 p.m. and midnight,
Wow.
And that's the beauty of writing, is that you can come back to it, and that you as long as you keep at it incrementally, eventually you'll have something that resembles a book. And that's like the whole idea of National Novel Writing Month. And I would encourage anyone who's watching, who wants to be a writer, just to stick with it, to not feel like they have to quit their day jobs and, like, I don't know, move to a writer's retreat. That there are lots of different ways to be a writer, and I certainly am an example of that, I think.
Kate has a question. Kate? Saying hi. Kate, do you have a question? You are unmuted.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
I was going to type it. I wanted to know how we, and especially as librarians, can help students that might be struggling to understand their emotions and offer support mental health support, but in a way that isn't offensive or maybe pushing people to a place they don't want to go quite yet. Like, do you have any suggestions? Like, what do you wish a librarian had been able to offer as a team?
So it kind of sounds like you're trying to say, how can I recommend a book about mental illness without labeling that person, without making them feel like they're being targeted? Is that kind of how you're?
Well, books and services,
Yeah.
because we offer a lot. As you know, we have a social worker, so it would be really great to be like, oh, you know what, you sound very overwhelmed. Maybe you would like to speak with our social worker. But I think some people, as you said, we have a lot of immigrant families that are struggling with the same issues as the characters in these books, or this book. I'm sorry, This Is My Brain in Love. And so how do we kind of get over the stigma? How can we be like a bridge to people that maybe not are aware of that support that's available?
That's a subject of like a 10-hour seminar, right? But I get, so one of them is talking to them about talking to them about where they seek support. So exactly. So it looks like you're sad. So who do you usually go to what do you usually do when you're sad? Who do you usually go to? Like suss that out. So it might not be their parents that they can talk to, but maybe it's a pastor for a lot of immigrant families that have come from highly spiritual backgrounds. Like their religious community is their support system rather than their parents. A lot of times their siblings might be their support system rather than their parents. And I know that's really hard during the pandemic because they don't necessarily have access to a lot of these communities. And so the other thing, I mean, that can be it's really easy is just, there are a lot of amazing Instagram sites or just Instagrammers that have a continual feed of positivity and like, this is okay and everything like that. And whether it has to do with like putting links to that or reposting things in that on the library website, like it's a way for people to start accessing the idea that, okay, yeah, people are talking about these issues. And I think when I was on a panel with Atib Karam, who wrote There's the Great Is Not Okay, and the woman who wrote The Beauty of All Things, which of course I'm blanking on, but she had a list of a lot of amazing Instagram sites that were easy points of entry, I think, especially for kids. With parents, sometimes when they're focusing on, literal, like bottom base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, things like food insufficiency and shelter, it's really, really tough. But it's also because so much of that can be mixed with, self-worth and pride and everything like that. But I think that showing the kids stories that they're not alone and, exposing them to literature about kids from lots of different socioeconomic statuses helps as well. And I wish I could give you more concrete things, and I'll try to follow up with some of them.
Well, thank you. That was great. I think we all learned a lot this afternoon. And will you be writing any books like talk about the pandemic or the recent or anything else current that's going on in this world?
Yeah, so the short story I just wrote for that Ridges and Islands anthology does kind of indirectly address the pandemic. And I was actually thinking about branching out into fantasy because it's sort of my first love. But I have an idea for a YA historical fantasy medical thriller that I've been tossing around for a while, but it's going to take a while for it to come into shape unless I quit my job soon.
Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the interesting thing is that my ideas really evolve over time with me, with current events. And so I do think that, there are a lot. I don't think anyone can have lived through this pandemic without hopefully a better understanding of the inequality that exists in this world and the things that we can improve on. And that's definitely going to inform my next book.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much today for your doing this program with me, and hope to see you soon in the near future. And I will send the video off to you once it's finished recording.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, have a good day. Thank you, ladies, for coming.